Okay, it looks like attendees joining is leveling off a little bit. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending where you are in the world. My name is Eric Page. I am Carnegie's Executive Vice President for Client Success. We're so pleased that you can join us here today for what we think is a very important conversation around the Supreme Court's decision on affirmative action and race-conscious admissions practices in higher education. I am joined today by a great group of panelists, some from within Carnegie, some from outside of Carnegie, and we are hoping this will be a two-way conversation between us and you all in the audience. So we have the chat feature, we have the Q&A. I will pose some questions for you all to respond to within the chat throughout. And then if you have questions that you would like our panelists to converse on or respond to, please submit them to the Q&A and we will get to those that we can. Again, I'm Eric Page, Carnegie's EVP for Client Success. Appreciate you all joining this morning, and we will do a quick round of introductions with our panelists and then get things started. Alana, I'll pass to you.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you to Carnegie for hosting this important and time-sensitive conversation. I'm Alana Forte. I'm Senior Vice President of Legal Compliance and the Office of People and Culture at Jacksonville University, and I'm also of counsel and advisor at Carnegie. It's great to be here.
Scott.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Scott O'Kander. I'm founding partner and chief leadership strategist for Carnegie. So it's great to be with you and look forward to a great conversation.
Mike.
Hi, everyone. Great to be with you this morning. Mike Keene, I'm the Senior Vice President of Modeling and Client Strategy here at Carnegie, and my team helps our institutional clients develop financial aid strategies aligned with institutional goals.
Excellent. And Cesar.
Buenos días todos. Cesar Mezquita, Director of Admissions, Western Washington University, beautiful Bellingham, Washington. Good morning.
Okay. We have intentionally assembled this panel to have representation from legal, from enrollment management, from financial aid perspective, to be able to answer as many questions as we can, acknowledging the fact that there is a lot within the context of this conversation that we don't know and can't know in this point in time. So before we get started here with our round robin on the panel, I do want to pose the question to you all in attendance that you can feel free to drop into the chat. Just any tangible actions that you all have taken on campus over the past 2 weeks as a result of the Supreme Court's ruling. Just drop in things that you all have done, steps you've taken as we're planning for a lot of schools opening the application process August 1st, and we'll kind of sort through those and react to them in real time. But definitely want to kick off the conversation with Alana to give us perspective on the Supreme Court's decision. What is it? What do we know? What don't we know? And what do we think it means for higher education?
Yes, that's a great place to start. So on June 29th, the United States Supreme Court ended race-conscious admissions programs. So with respect to University of North Carolina, this is a 6-3 decision, and the holding was that they violated the Equal Protection Clause as a state actor of the 14th Amendment, and then Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And then with respect to Harvard as a private institution, it was a 6-2 decision with Justice Jackson recusing herself. But basically, they held that the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act was violated. So this holding, in effect, it ends the ability for colleges and universities, both public and private, to consider race as one of many factors in admissions decisions. And so with quoting the court, a student must be treated based on their ability as an individual, not on the basis of race. I'd like to take a moment to say there was an exception made. So for military academies, they are still able to consider race as one of many factors when they make admission decisions. And so for the rest of us as institutions, please know the only real legal issue before the court was the consideration of race in admissions. So as we have this conversation today, it can be a little bit murky, because the Supremes as a majority court did not overrule the prior case law, nor did they establish new case law. They simply said race neutral factors must be used when making admissions decisions. And then they closed, Justice Roberts concluded the opinion by basically saying nothing prohibits or precludes a college or university from considering an applicant's discussion of race and how it's impacted the applicant's life, so long as the discussion is concretely tied or there's a nexus to the quality or character of the individual, their unique abilities, and how the applicant can contribute to the university.
Okay, thank you. Do you expect to see in the near future, midterm future, further clarification on that? I know the initial reaction I heard from a lot of people was a good amount of confusion in terms of exactly what this means.
Absolutely. The White House, as well as the Department of Education, has led us to believe that within the next month or so, we should get additional guidance and clarification. And that's really going to help us as institutions prepare for the fall and application season.
Okay. And I know there was sort of a domino effect, at least in some states, of other rulings and things related to this that impact college admissions, enrollment, recruitment. A quick summary of those are things we've seen, and maybe this is for any of the panelists, other things we've seen happen as a result around the country that change the game. Anyone on that? I know we've seen some states, I think the state of Missouri took pretty swift action on financial aid specific to minority student populations and things, but I'll be curious to see in the coming months and weeks even to things that happen centered around that with decisions made at the state level as a result of the decision. Mike, I'll jump to you on the financial aid front, kind of playing off the state of Missouri deal. What does this mean for student financial aid practices, how schools award, how they are able to award, and how they have traditionally used that to shape diversity of their classes?
Sure. And I think that this is a frustrating answer, but it's the most honest answer. And that's that we know it will impact aid. We know we don't know exactly to what extent. And the truest answer is it depends. As Alana mentioned, the decision did not directly address race-conscious aid. And I think the reality is that when there is uncertainty, there is variation. And so there's going to be variation in how institutions respond. And that's going to be conditioned on a few things. What the institution should calibrate their response on the basis of legal guidance they received from their own counsel, from internal and external subject matter experts. But there's also going to be variation based on the institution's appetite for legal risk in continuing to engage in the practice of race-conscious aid. And I think that while we don't look forward to legal challenges, we understand that part of the clarity that will come about the applicability of these decisions to race-conscious aid, or to aid that is administered at least in part on the basis of students' self-reported racial or ethnic identity, will come from legal challenges and the litigation of those challenges and the outcomes there. So I think for institutions specifically, they have to calibrate what is their appetite for legal exposure, what is the extent to which racial or ethnic identity is currently used in the administration of aid, and what is their guidance from internal counsel, external counsel, subject matter experts, and then come up with a strategy for how to address that. I think that the playing field will be defined by the outcome over the course of the coming months and years of those legal challenges and the outcomes there. Alongside, as you mentioned, the state of Missouri, there's been other states, we've also seen this in Kentucky and Wisconsin so far, that particularly for public institutions, the statewide and potentially legislative action to preclude the use of race or ethnicity in the awarding of gift aid. I will say, and I am not a lawyer, this is entirely my opinion, but I think to some extent it's guided by institutional practice and guidance to institutions even prior to the UNC and Harvard decisions, is that it's quite likely that gift aid programs or institutional aid programs that are exclusive or that are expressly limited to students of a particular racial or ethnic identity are at far greater risk than programs which consider race or ethnicity as one of a variety of considerations. And then downstream, especially when we get into restricted aid and things like that, there's other considerations, other institutional strategies that you can take. But I think the summary is it will affect aid, but I think that's going to be defined frustratingly, at least in part, by the outcome of legal challenges over the course of the next few months and years.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Cesar and Scott, I think for you from an enrollment lens, if we can't use race data in the admissions decision process, we can't use it in the financial aid awarding process, very likely that's going to change drastically. Where can we use race data in student recruitment, in marketing, and what do we think, or what do you both think that looks like moving forward?
Yeah, before passing over to Scott, let me just offer a couple things over here. Some of y'all may know that this, a lot of the states over here on the West Coast, Washington has been under state law since 1998. So 25 years where we were precluded from using race in terms of hiring practices and financial aid and admissions, the admissions process. But there's still a lot of agency that we can exercise in the work that we do. Even though I was not here during that period of transition back in 98, I've come to appreciate how even aspects of DEI, which I recognize it's a 4-letter word, 3-letter word, as it were, for many of you all across the country. But there's been expansion of that little acronym to include aspects of access, so ADEI, and then more recently, belonging. And I know that sometimes here us on the West Coast, we have a tendency to overcomplicate things in our progressive way of thinking and planning, but words matter. When you think about now taking an approach of this to say, what does access look like? And the racial overlays with a lot of the socioeconomic indicators, particularly when you look at the geography of any state, but let's take state of Washington, rural areas, economically depressed areas, the overlay there is going to be significant in that the impact on the students in their lacking of access to opportunities in their secondary schooling and in certainly higher ed. This is the irony of it all, is that in many ways, the more we want to focus on race, the less we need to focus on races. We're going to need, at the very least, meet the letter of the law and certainly meet any kind of institutional goals and missions that we have out there going forward. So it's a little bit of an irony there. Right? We can't focus on race, but in many ways, we're going to be able to still focus on race.
Yeah, I agree with what Cesar was saying in many respects. It comes down to there are a lot of proxies for different aspects of access, and balance is a real key. One thought I have is around this idea of how are you evaluating an application? A lot of schools use, for example, a high school strength indicator or high school rank as a function of their admissions decision. Well, how fair is that if race then can't also be considered as a potential part of that admissions practice? And to your earlier question, Eric, when you asked at the beginning, and Cesar noted in Washington, it's 1998, but there are a number of states who have had significant legal sort of banning of race in college admissions. And we have seen data that suggests that those states don't perform as well on balance. And so I think this is sort of cascading federal ruling will also create the opportunity, much in the way that it did with, say, the Roe decision, where states will feel empowered to make further restrictions on things they don't want to have in whatever political environment you're in, whatever state you're in. And so I think as, sort of carrying admissions populations, we need to think about balance as a key sort of regimen in our strategies. That if we have too many things that sway towards one type of, say, demographic, we need to start thinking about how many things should be put in place to create balance and make it something very, very good for the overall campus environment.
One thing too, we talk about student access to higher education. I know that was very, very top of mind throughout the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, that access gap has widened, and a lot of good work has been done across higher education to try to help students have better access to higher education. If I'm a student on the receiving end of this decision or seeing this in the news, how am I feeling? How does this impact me, particularly if I'm a student from an underrepresented population? And what can higher education do? And this is a question for all of you, to better serve those students, to communicate with students throughout this window of time and ensure that the group that we're all here trying to serve doesn't get left behind.
So I just want to start off with the impact of your question, Aaron. I think colleges and universities have a unique opportunity right now to re-examine all of their policies, all of their procedures across the university, not just enrollment, and be thoughtful. Often when we get a decision, we'll just change that one thing in the aspect that's impacted. But here, as you think about institutional goals, visions, values, and how that shapes your applicant pool or university stakeholder, how can we adjust to ensure that diversity that makes a comprehensive education better as preparing globally minded citizens for the real world? What can we do? And so we think of just, being compliant with this law, but are there policies or procedures? Is there a VIP legacy list? Is there, are there things that we uphold within the university that are now more out of alignment because it's not actually furthering the mission or the values of the institution? And so I ask us just to be thoughtful and proactive. And that will be heard, seen, and felt by all students, and hopefully impact what I would say historically underrepresented students. I saw, one of our guests say the school sent out a message to align the community and let them know what their values and their missions are, and that they're not going to stop working towards those missions based on this decision. And so doing that in practice truly helps, doing the work behind it.
Let me offer something over here with regards to my N of 3. I have 3 kiddos, each of which identify as Latino, and it's been interesting to hear their take on this. You have the youngest, who is going to be a senior in high school and is thinking, oh my gosh, the sky's falling. Here you go. Way to go, racist America. Here's one more chapter, right? And then you have the oldest, who's going to be a senior in college at a prominent university, who's going, yeah, I'm not sure this really matters, because it has to be on that individual aspect of achievement and accomplishing experience and all of this, right? So you just in that N of 3, I saw the difference in opinion and how we all are probably navigating through this, and how we struggle with even the concept of affirmative action writ large. But here's the thing, right? As I started process, particularly for the prospective students, right? Perhaps what you're getting at, to being intentional, the way that Alana pointed out, how are we intentionally messaging some aspects of institutional value and institutional sense of belonging and community and place, and how that may resonate with the student. So that's for the prospective student and their families and their sense of identity. And then you have the currently enrolled students. So here's actually worth noting for our colleagues who work in the Board of the Student Affairs side of things. Think about the currently enrolled student who perhaps already had an aspect of imposter syndrome before this. Now they're going to a very, very elite institution. All of this light has been cast on them and say, see, there you go. We only got in because via the affirmative action thing. I put that out there for my colleagues who may be having a bit of a wave from their student populations on campus, who may be struggling to process this and may need some different kinds of outreach there. So that space of intentionality is going to be important.
Yeah, that actually touches on a good point that I wanted to ask the group, or Scott, Cesar, maybe you in this. There are many different kinds of institutions across the country that are impacted by this. I think when I worked at the University of Iowa, I think we admitted 74% of students who applied. Cesar, I think Western Washington is in that realm, maybe 80% or higher. And then we've got schools that admit 2-3% of students. How is this different for institutions of those types? And how do we think that impacts the admissions practices, the process that those schools are going to have to take as a result?
Oh, there's a lot there to unpack. I mean, I think Alana nailed it, honestly. And I think one of the key takeaways from this panel should be what she said earlier about looking at everything. Because if you considered you were in a state where race was enabled to be considered for admissions prior to the SCOTUS decision, and then now it's not, and you don't look at everything, that by default could actually mean that you're more imbalanced than ever come the end of 2024. So I really feel strongly that looking at everything is a critical thing, and looking to rebalance what your initiatives. It's such a big piece of the puzzle here as we move forward. And I know, and we can see in the chat here, some schools doing some really good things like essays, recrafting essays to enable for more input around sort of how race has impacted or ethnicity has impacted the student journey, things like that. Would be a really good way to start thinking about rebalancing. There's a number of other things that I can imagine as well that we can talk about as we go on.
had a colleague who quipped so very wonderfully. He said, if we're going to live our mission, we have to do things differently. And then he added, and if we're going to be doing things differently, we have to live our mission. So it's one of those kinds of things where we make you stop and go, oh yeah, what does that really mean? And in that conversation, it was like, we need to, whether you've been at an institution where aspects of this balance has been a little bit more established, again, here, Washington State, 25 years, but we still struggle. We still are looking at this every so often going, where are our blind spots? Where are the places in which we are perhaps amiss on some of these elements? And look in the mirror, right? At some point, I think a lot of folks, there's a tendency right now to be looking at the skies going, the sky is falling, or cursing at the SCOTUS and all of these institutional racism things. Yes, it's worth acknowledging, inventing, and talking and unpacking it. But what does it look like when you internalize and operationalize these elements? There's going to be a lot of discomfort. Welcome that, but then harness some of that energy within your team, within your stakeholder group, certainly within your legal counsel as you see fit, in order to develop those practices and those policies as you move forward. So welcome that discomfort and step into that wind, no doubt.
We've got a good question in the Q&A that I think brings up an interesting point, and Cesar, maybe this is relevant for you, having practiced in a state where this has been the case for a long time, is institutions have goals around diverse classes, right? They want to achieve a certain balance, and traditionally the admissions director, the VP of enrollment, that office has been tasked with both achieving those goals, achieving enrollment goals, and making the decision around that student. And how do you in the state of Washington, have you worked in that way? Because I would assume that you've had priorities around diversification of the class, and diversity means a lot of different things. And balanced that. What are the other variables that you are considering or looking at to help you achieve diversity in enrolling a class?
What I've noticed, again, when I landed over here 7 years ago, this had been already a practice in the state for a while. But then in talking to the colleagues who had been already established at other institutions, right, University of Washington, WSU, and others, Washington State University, and others, is to see how the expanded definition of institutional success is related to diversity. So our ability to look. So basically, you're extracting a lot of this aggregate data from the individual decision making level, as it was in the practices in other states, right? We're looking at that individual. If you had a, African American or Latino, so there you go, check it off on the application. You go, you're going to be able to achieve your goals. I'm oversimplifying, of course, right? But here in the state of Washington, since that cannot be done, so there are some other ways in which you can still achieve a lot of institutional goals, but then you have to really expand on what those goals are. It can't be in that dichotomy, Black or white or Latino or otherwise, right? You have to then think in terms of socioeconomic diversity, rural and urban diversity, some aspects of students who are first generation, military background is one. It's one of those other metrics that we report on regularly, and we're able to say, okay, yeah, so we're able to hit the marks on a lot of these things, maybe miss the marks on some of these others, but are we making progress overall as we look at our institutional mission and vision as we try to achieve those? So it's been critically important to have a better appreciation of what that expanded view of diversity and what it really means.
Can I jump in here too? One of the things I was going to say is, so just generally speaking, there's this fundamental strategic philosophy that at least I have, and I know at Carnegie we have, which is just there is always a way. And Cesar is really speaking to that in many respects. And I think it's high time we actually looked at the ways, right? Because I think there is certain things, like we could look at neighborhood, we could look at income, we could look at school index. Yeah, those are easy things to sort of serve as proxies, but there's a lot of other things we can use for proxies. At Carnegie, we use 750 different demographic variables to look at certain types of situations. Maybe it's time we expand that. And if we talk balance, we can start looking at what are the media habits? What are some of the social sites people are following? What are some of the aspects that we can look at that are not just the typical proxies, because it may leave some students out if we do that. And so, not that I would say to abandon something like income or or neighborhood or other kinds of things as proxies, but I think we should look at a broader range of demographics when we're thinking about the future in this space. Because a broader range is almost always going to lead us to a more equitable conclusion when we start looking at different factors. And so that's one of the things that I would say, generally speaking, strategically, there's always a way. And the question is exactly how. And so expanding demographics might be one of the best ways. I mean, doing the essay changes, looking at aggregate data, as Cesar mentioned earlier. There's a lot of things that we can be doing to sort of see, are we achieving? But it's time to start, strategically broadening, and in many ways, as difficult as it is to say, increasing the complexity of the data we're looking at so that we can get to a better outcome in the end.
Just a quick example, it goes to a question that Eric asked a little bit earlier. What can you do in areas of marketing, for example, right? And how we are living our brand and promoting our genuine institutional and community values. Had a conversation this last week with an AVP for the area that oversees, amongst others, the area of LGBTQ plus. So for students who have those identities, and a lot of the intersections of identities, right? Students who identify as Black and Latino. So there's a group there that has an intersection with LGBTQ. So having a conversation with them and say, let's refine our message for the incoming class about the services and the opportunities in our space. So gender affirming care and tea time for trans students, right? So these events and activities are going to be coming up in the fall. There's nothing about that was really impacting the decision on the admission side. So, okay, on the legal muster, we're okay. But we're promoting institutional value to now this community of students, these students with these identities rather, and they, of course, by extension, are now feeling great, a sense of affirmation in their choices in institution, sense of affirmation in their sense of identity and collectively and individually. And they, by extension, we can surmise this, they're taking that to their own communities, to their own families, and now expressing this going, wow, I have trans teas on Thursdays here at Western Washington University. It's absolutely phenomenal. So those are the things that we can and should be doing, thinking very, very intentionally on how to deploy those.
Good question in the Q&A around how would you advise people to because obviously everybody on a college campus is not going to see this as a bad decision. How do we bridge gaps there and work with folks across campus who might be celebrating this decision by the Supreme Court?
So from my perspective, sorry, Scott, do you want to?
Oh, go ahead, go, you take it.
So the mission critical value as universities is we're focusing on retention to ensure that we're getting students to and through to graduation so they can be successful, do their best work, thrive in the marketplace, right? And so I think Cesar mentioned this, the goal is a culture of belonging. As we look at the demographic shift and enrollment cliff and all these different intersectionalities of where we are as a higher education ever-changing landscape, it's really important for us to know the majority of college students. It's growing and growing and growing to be more minority. And so if we are not prioritizing programs, policies, and resources for our growing majority consumer, then we are failing as an institution. And so I don't think that's an emotional appeal. I think that's a practical business, common sense approach to ensure we're accomplishing these institutional values. I think that helps regardless of where people are on the spectrum on how they feel about this decision. The university must encourage and foster that culture of belonging. Scott.
I actually was going to say something similar, but just celebrating a diverse environment is a big thing, because I think most people generally want that. Most students want to be part of an environment of diverse perspectives and opinions and backgrounds, and just celebrating it is a big piece of the puzzle, and not making it something that's taboo. If there's a feeling of celebration among some groups, I think it probably is rooted in this sort of fairness argument, but it's not generally sitting in the area of sort of a great community, a great balanced, equitable, diverse community. So celebrating that can be a big factor.
On that note, Scott and Alana, I think most campuses, if not all, have some sort of DEIB office on campus that have gained a lot of traction over the past several years. How can enrollment offices, marketing offices, financial aid offices better partner with those DEI offices on campus coming out of this? Do we think that we can see some good things happen there? Or other things happening, say they're on your campus, or anybody in the chat? Maybe that's a question for partnership between enrollment and DEI offices where we're seeing productive things happening.
I could start with a short one. Just, I think Cesar, what Cesar was saying a bit ago around communicate the marketing side of what you promote. I think we could do a better job of that at a lot of schools. Connecting the DEI and the marketing together could be a really great recipe for creating some very welcoming content that brings attraction to a school. And given Alana's and the data's reality, Alana's point and the data's reality around just the sheer demographic shift within the US and the way that college admissions is going to look 5-10 years from now, or even next year, we have to start paying attention to things like that, and most schools should really be doing that at this point.
Yeah, our work with the ADEI office here, actually the AVP that I was talking about is the AVP for ADEI at the university, has been instrumental in us advancing a lot of this aspect of access, truly, and the belonging, no doubt. And then how it manifests itself down on the tactical level, inviting those representatives from that office into an update with your admission counselors, for example, right? So you can hear the latest on developments of institutional programming, as well as legal ramifications of recent decisions, whether it was trans rights in some states and how that was affecting those populations about several months ago, to now more recently the SCOTUS decision. And then on the messaging side, we not in messaging, but very intentionally partnering with student clubs and organizations at that next layer down of the genuine and intentionally messaging out of the student experience. So our Admitted Students Day, for example, has a panel for what's what we call Being BIPOC, by Black, Indigenous, people of color. Being BIPOC at Western, again, has nothing to do with the admissions decision. This is based on students who have already been confirmed and been admitted to the university. And we bring those student representatives to speak very intentionally about what it's like to study and live in a predominantly white institution. Great information for those families who are coming in. And of course, that message goes out into the great blue beyond for when those students go home into their communities.
Thank you. Mike, going to jump back to you on the financial aid modeling retention front. There potentially will be data points lost in this in terms of what is gathered. What worries you, or what's on your mind there in terms of the impact on our ability to model for financial aid for retention and ultimately things that have been serving students over the years?
Sure. I think that this is one of the things that we pay most close attention to in the interpretation of the decisions, and what we're working with our institutions now, and being attentive to how institutions are framing this generally, as well as vendors, because this is a partnership between institutions and vendors on what you're collecting on the application and to whom it's available during the review process. Selfishly, from our perspective, as we're building quantitative models to come to an expectation of what the outcome of a particular set of admitted students is, or the particular combination of an admit pool plus a financial aid strategy, even in a way that never impacts the admission decision, students' identity, whether that's sex or ethnicity or other geodemographic attributes, can have a significant difference in projecting out the outcome of a cohort. And so even for an institution that is following both the letter and the spirit of these decisions, they still want to know what is going to be the outcome, and knowing that student self-reported race and ethnicity might be a variable in a model that helps predict the outcome. And we want to make sure that institutions are still able to and confident that they are able to collect these data and transmit them to us and track them in an aggregate fashion. I think the real challenge comes with as institutions, and we've seen these conversations with Slate, we've seen these conversations with the Common App, as institutions seek to mask student self-reported race and ethnicity from the application reviewers, there's a tension, and I think this came up in one of the Q&A from the audience earlier, is how do you mask that effectively when there are admission leaders that need to be aware of the compositional attributes of the pool as a whole, but also maybe making individual level admission decisions. So I think there's two pieces here. One is that institutions need to come to an understanding of who's going to have access to these data and what their sort of appetite is for potentially decision makers having also access to the compositional attributes of the entire cohort. And then separately, there's are you still going to be able to share these data with teams like mine so that you can still have a general understanding of what the outcome of the cohort is going to be, and you don't need to stop considering the impact of race and ethnicity on projected outcomes entirely. There's another piece here, which is that many institutions, especially many institutions that have practiced race conscious admission and have been effective in doing so, are going to be interested in what the projected outcome of race neutral alternatives is. And it's really difficult to do that without two things. It's difficult to do that without continuing to collect that data and providing it to vendors or to internal partners on campus who do that analysis for you. And it's difficult to do that work for fall 24 without at least somewhat applying it to your fall 23 pool. In other words, if you intend to come up with a score or a rubric that evaluates student personal statements and essays on the extent to which students overcame obstacles in their personal journey, we need that for fall 23 to be able to develop an expectation of what that will produce for fall 24. And that's an uncomfortable discussion with some of our institutional clients right now, because it's one thing to say, we are confident that we can come up with a rubric that will fit with the context, that will meet the letter of the law and help move the needle on what we're trying to achieve. But we really don't want to go back and score 1,000 applications on this same rubric last year. But that's the reality of what we do need to be able to develop an expectation of how that will affect the composition of the class. You mentioned retention. I think there's also those downstream impacts, and this has come up in particular with CRMs or tools where there are components of race and ethnicity that might be in a retention model and might even pop up as a risk factor, and the ways that those are tracked. I think it's important that institutions try to firewall the race and ethnicity data from decision makers while still making it available such that it can still be included as one of a variety of different factors in predicting these outcomes. I say that acknowledging that that might be realistic for an institution that has an admission staff of 15, 20, 25, or a student affairs staff of 10, 15, 20. But for smaller institutions, the folks that are tracking the composition of the class are also often those that are making the admission decision. And that means that the real challenge there for smaller institutions, or for institutions where admission leadership are involved day to day in making these, especially these last 10%, last 15%, admission decisions, to be able to effectively firewall the data about the composition of the class as a whole from those decisions. So I think it's something that institutions have to come to an honest decision about in the context of their resources and what's possible. But it's a real administrative challenge. And our hope is that we can continue to collect these data, because it's critical for us to have these data to be able to project those outcomes and guide institutions in adopting race neutral methods to hopefully achieve at least some of the diversity that has been their compelling interest for so long.
Thank you. Interesting question in the Q&A that I actually thought about initially. I don't know if we know enough to speculate on this, or if there will be more clarity, but it's specific to college athletes that might have a disproportionate ratio of minority students within that group, and some of whom are granted academic waivers coming in the door. Does this impact that directly? Do we know how that might impact those students, or have a bearing on the practices we've seen in college athletics?
I believe the NCAA is coming out with guidance on supporting diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. They're actually requiring, I know for a fact, Division I schools to have a diversity officer dedicated to athletes. And so when it comes to the goals and the mission of the university, depending on where it is, I think there are safeguards in place there. But I think it's so early, it's difficult to foresee all of the areas that this could impact, or where there are going to be gaps based on what we've done thus far. So.
Well, and I think in a lot of those cases too, the variable that might be playing into the admissions decision is athletic ability or recruitment. And, race aside, the fact that that student might be a minority, it's the fact that they're a good athlete that might be influencing the decision or the academic waiver, correct?
Right. And I don't want to be a red herring, but I think that's one of the issues with this decision, just from a common sense perspective, because when an enrollment leader is making decisions or with the committee, they're often thinking about the comprehensive approach of the university, right? So you can have a very diverse school, but you don't have enough male dancers. And so you may take a male dancer that has a GPA a little bit lower because they're very talented. That's their talent. It may happen in a cohort with health sciences where you have majority female. So those things are tied to a protected class. It's not race. But it may happen with Black engineers or with women aviators. And so they're singling out one protected feature, but now similarly situated people are going to be treated differently. So the impact of this decision is going to open the door to other concerns and issues on how we enroll students today.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And it speaks to that individual experience, right? Just to riff on what Lana was saying right there, is like to the letter of the law, right? To Justice Roberts, that individual experience, an athlete, a dancer, some other attribute of that student experience and what they would bring into the university, then it's compelling, right, to make that decision. So speaking to you all from 25 years in the future, having watched and done this, it's actually quite, I don't need to be flippant about any of this. These are serious topics, but it is quite refreshing to be engaging. And here we are at Division II school, engaging with coaches, and race never comes up. We don't look at it. We talk in terms of, is a student academically prepared? Is a student going to bring value and talent to the composition of your cohort? And will we be able to support them in their progression here at the university without race ever really having entered the fray? It's quite remarkable.
Yeah.
Aspirationally, that's where we want to be, right? So
that's the goal. Well, we are up against our time. That we knew it would go fast, and it certainly did go fast. But we appreciate all of you taking time to join us today on a Friday for this very important conversation around the future of college admissions in this new landscape. So on behalf of Carnegie and my colleagues here today, thank you all and have a great weekend.